And Ferrari finally win in Italy. Get in! So well done for Charles Leclerc winning his second race for Ferrari in Italy. It was an amazing race and he just took it by the scruff of the neck and he managed to pull out a result for Ferrari, which was really, really good. What was super impressive about his win is the way that he managed to defend against Hamilton, though Hamilton had the better tyres and the Mercedes is obviously better and kinder on the tyres as well. And despite Charles being on the harder tyre, which I think is about 0.8 of a second slower than Hamilton's compound, he still managed to defend quite well, and I think that was really, really impressive. Hamilton did force him into a few mistakes, as we sort of saw in the race in there. There's a couple of questionable moves in there from Charles Leclerc, but I think still, given his position, he did a really good job actually, and I think he gave Hamilton a real good run for his money. The one thing that did help Charles Leclerc really well though is the fact that they had all of that straight line speed advantage. You could see it as how Hamilton was closing in on the straights. He just didn't have enough speed to take him in, turning into the first corner. And that was a very interesting chess game puzzle for me, because what am I talking about? Either way, a fantastic race for Charles, and I'm super happy that he's won. This is Ferrari's second win of the season as well. In the beginning of the year, I thought we would be seeing a lot more Ferrari wins, but it hasn't turned out that way so far. But they did at least manage to materialize in both Spa and now in Monza, which really suits the design of their car, which is obviously very low drag. Now, while on the subject of Ferrari, Paul Vettel found himself in trouble yet again. He's either hitting someone, being hit, or spinning. This time he just spun and created an absolute chaos when he did, because he almost took away two cars with him. It hasn't worked out very well for Vettel this season. He seems to be, I don't know, very good at getting himself into trouble. It hasn't always been like this for Vettel, and obviously he knows how to win races and he knows how to lead from the front, but over the last 2 years or so, he's been making a lot of mistakes, whether he's being hit, doing the hitting himself, or spinning under pressure. He seems to have lost his way somewhat. To be honest, only Vettel really knows what's happening to Vettel, but either way, I still think that he'll bounce back at some point in the season. I mean, I don't see the season ending without Vettel getting, at the very least, one win. What was the interesting fact I wanted to talk about? Ah yes, I remember now. Here's a fun fact for you. Yes, now I'm ready. Here it comes, okay? You ready? Right, this is the first time that Ferrari win at home since 2010. 2010? How time flies, it's unbelievable. And of course, like Charles Leclerc said himself after the race, if you're going to win any races for Ferrari, where better to win it than Italy? I think his victory is going to be very popular amongst the Tifosi gang. But the real question for me is this the beginning of the end for Vettel as a number one driver? Is it just a run of good races for Charles and then he'll sort of fade off towards the end of the year? Or is there a psychological shift and a change within Ferrari that maybe it's becoming more apparent now with the races that actually Charles might be a little bit heading, is what I was looking for, heading towards being the number one driver at Ferrari? I don't think that this is going to make a difference too much this year, but I think for next year, Charles might get himself at least an equal drive. Now, of course, talking about number one drivers, how can we forget the pressure that Hamilton was mounting on Charles Leclerc? Now, I think we all saw it. Hamilton, I think he drove his socks out trying to get and catch Charles, but at the end of it, he just didn't have enough top speed. I mean, I think at once he was 0.3 or 0.2 behind Charles after Charles made a mistake, and yet still he didn't have the top speed required to overtake Charles. I think the DRS actually equaled his speed with Charles at the end of the straight. So the 8 kilometer difference between the two looks like it was made up by the DRS, but it wasn't enough to then overtake. It was just enough to sort of keep in touch with Charles, and I think that was Mercedes' downfall in this race. It was always going to be the case. Hamilton had 2, I think, maybe 3 really good attempts at overtaking Charles, but Charles did kind of have slightly questionable defensive tactics against Hamilton there, especially ones where he drove Hamilton off the track, and obviously Hamilton's claim against that was that Charles was defending under braking, However, no disservice to Charles whatsoever. He still deserves to win this race, hands down. So, however, this is still obviously very good for Hamilton. He walks away losing only 2 points to his main rival Bottas, and I believe he's 63 points ahead now, but I'm gonna have to double check my numbers. So I think Hamilton is going to be happy, and I think Mercedes are going to be happy. So they didn't win, but it looks like it was still a strong race for them regardless. Valtteri Bottas. No. Let me try that again. Valtteri Bottas. So though Bottas overtook Hamilton on the first corner, I really thought that Bottas at the time was going to keep his position, but then Hamilton overtook him back really quickly, and then he stayed fairly quiet until the latter stages of the race. Hamilton making a mistake opened up a chance for Valtteri Bottas to then be able to go and attack Charles Leclerc, and so he did, and he was closing in on Charles, I think at one point half a second per lap, and then that reduced to 3 or 2 maybe, 2/10 of a second per lap, until he got in Valtteri Bottas' wake. Now, after Hamilton's mistake, Bottas looked really fast, but he failed to mount a challenge on Charles. And I think that's down to Bottas making a few mistakes, especially under braking into turn 1 when he was chasing Charles down. So Bottas got a little bit unlucky in there, I think. And obviously, you know, just to get this out there, it wasn't because Bottas' tires had reached the curve and drop off in performance. This is because Bottas wasn't really getting the best out of his car, and he made a few mistakes, and so it didn't quite work out for him. But I think even if he hadn't made any mistakes and he was in the gearbox of Charles, I think that he would have had the same exact problem as Hamilton, which is the lack of top speed. And I don't think that Bottas would have been able to do any better when it came to overtaking Charles at the end of the home straight. So, but regardless, it was still a good race for Mercedes. They had 2 drivers in the podium, and they've extended their Constructors' Championship points against Ferrari too. So all good for them. Renault. Wow. I mean, what? Where did that come from? It's amazing. Here's a little fun fact for you, and this time I remember it. This is their first top 5 finish since 2008. Wow, that's a long time. 8 years. Time flies. Needless to say, that was super impressive from Renault, and I think both of their drivers are going to be very happy with that performance. And what was interesting for me personally is how much further ahead Renault were in this race than their rivals McLaren on the same engine. It seems to be that Renault has got some sort of an upgrade or some sort of a tweak or some setting in the car, perhaps a low drag setup that has really helped them get one over McLaren in this particular track. But I think this result sort of really highlights the difference in between McLaren and Renault, because Renault seems to have a little bit more pace on these longer straights, though they didn't in Spa, but they managed to do it in Monza, and McLaren obviously lagged quite a lot behind. And I think that sort of highlights the philosophy in between the two, because McLaren does really well on higher downforce tracks, whereas Renault obviously did really well in Spa. So now, talking of McLaren, it wasn't a very exciting race for them now, was it? Norris, of course, did a really decent job. He managed to come home 10th after starting 14th on the grid. So I think that was really good for McLaren, especially if they're complaining about top line speed. Sainz was also doing really well on his McLaren before, of course, he had a mechanical failure and had to retire from the race. So this wasn't the best race for McLaren. Who else impressed me? Alex Albon. Again, it was a really solid weekend from him. This time it was a little bit more eventful, should we say, because he had a little tussle with Carlos and obviously ended up on the wrong side of the track. I managed to rejoin though and make his way back up. But again, this was one of the races where Alex Albon has really shown that he's managed to settle in the Red Bull super well actually, and on his second race has managed to beat Max again. I know this is not a fair comparison, Max had his own problems and he didn't beat Max on pace per se, but he still ended up bringing home Red Bull the highest number of points for the weekend, so really well done to him. Now, talking of Max, of course, he started all the way from the back of the grid, so it wasn't ideal for him, but he still had a very successful weekend, I would say. He managed to, make his way up to 8th. But I think this is one of his quieter races, of course, because it wasn't in the sharp end, so we didn't get to see Max doing much. However, this was still a very successful weekend for Red Bull, both drivers on the points, of course, and I think that for the rest of the season, it's probably very likely that Red Bull are going to be targeting, or at least trying to catch Ferrari the Constructors' Championship until towards the end of the year. I think the next tracks coming up really suit Red Bull. with their higher downforce. Singapore especially is going to be, I think, a good hunting ground for Red Bull, and I think Ferrari is going to suffer in some of those tracks, and so we might see a swing in the championship very soon, but let's see what happens. What other exciting things happened in the race? Wait for this, I got this. Ah, yes, now I remember. Lance Stroll, wow, he was actually running quite well until he had the unlucky event of meeting Vettel just rejoining the track, and that could have almost ended up in disaster. I'm so glad he managed to avoid Vettel. I don't know if you guys seen it, but if you look at the onboard shot from Stroll's camera, it really did not look good. As he was coming into the corner, Vettel was just there and he stuck his car out. I don't know, he's got lightning reflections, because for him to avoid Vettel the way that he did, he should get driver of the day. Quite honestly, that was super close. I also think that if that crash had happened slightly down more towards the midfield, we could have had a pile of cars crashing into one another, because the way that Vettel was rejoining the track, it was actually quite blind and it was difficult to see, which is why Stroll almost hit him. Now, let's not forget about Giovinazzi. He did really well to come home 9th. Being the only Italian driver in Italy is obviously a massive pleasure. No pressure at all, and I'm sure that the Italians were very happy for him to come home in the points. Now, I don't know what you guys sort of think of him so far, but I mean, in my opinion, he's kind of failed to show any real pace or any magic thus far. Yes, he's Italian, yes, he's racing for Alfa Romeo, yes, it's Italy, but in reality, if you look at the season, he hasn't really done much yet. He hasn't done anything particularly special, and in 9 times out of 10 he looks like he's a little bit slower, in fact, than Kimi. Now for Williams, of course, they didn't do very well at all in this particular race. Yeah, Williams were complaining this weekend about a lack of top speed. Their chances of overtaking wasn't very strong anyway, and it seems to be that their lack of downforce isn't necessarily down to design, because if it was, then they would have been able to have a lot more speed on the straights, and then they should have been in there for at least some overtakes. Fortunately, that didn't happen for them. To be fair, I honestly can't wait for Williams to be competitive again, and I hope that they'll manage to find some sort of pace before the year ends, so we can at least see them do something. If they could grab that 1 point, I think we'd all be happy for them. Even if you're not a Williams fan, deep down somewhere, we would be super happy for them. That's it from me today. It was an amazing race, and I'll see you guys next time.